Up close and personal now with Roy Williams. Roy Williams is a name that you would probably not know. He's a former high-profile Sydney lawyer. He's described as an emerging public intellectual, and he's in Brisbane at the moment, I think speaking tomorrow night at the Zen Bar, I believe it is, to offer his answer to a question that has exercised the minds of sceptics for centuries. Why should you believe in God? In his best-selling book, God Actually, first published by ABC Books, I think, 2 years ago, it's now on sale in Britain and the north of America. Roy Williams contends that beliefs should be based on logical deductions from known facts, and that it is not a matter of blind faith. He's one of Australia's emerging intellectuals. His book reviews have appeared regularly in the Weekend Australian newspaper, and he's a regular contributor to the Sydney Morning Herald, the Australian Literary Review, and more. God Actually is his first book, and I spoke to him earlier on this week and asked him if he was invited to the Global Atheist Conference that was held recently in Melbourne.
No, I didn't. I would have loved to have been there, but I didn't get an invitation and didn't feel the urge to just turn up.
You are described correctly or incorrectly as an intellectual or a Christian intellectual in terms of publicity material. Is that true?
Yes, it probably is, as close as Australia has to a public Christian intellectual, although I hasten to say I haven't got any formal theological qualifications. My academic training is in law and literature.
You've worked for one of the major heavy hitter law firms in this country and have got a significant academic reputation. Do you describe yourself as a lawyer or as an intellectual or as a writer or as something else?
I call myself a writer now and former lawyer. My legal training was invaluable, Steve, in terms of not just the writing of the book, but being trained in how to think, how to express yourself, how to weigh evidence, assess credibility, really hone in on the guts of an argument. The law teaches you all of those things, and so in that sense I'm still very much a lawyer and always will be the product of that training.
Had you have been invited to the Global Atheist Conference, and as I understand it, not one non-atheist was invited, which is unusual.
I think a fellow called Greg Clark from the Centre for Public Christianity did go down there. I'm not quite sure what Greg ended up doing, but and I hope he did go, because they needed more people to, Daniel in the lion's den, to get in there and explain the faith in a reasonable, rational sort of way to people who probably have never been exposed to it. They've been exposed to straw men and caricatures of the real thing rather than the Gospels properly explained.
What would you have said to them? You would have been unwelcome, if not ridiculed.
Probably, but I find that with more or less anybody, including atheists, if you listen patiently to the initial barrage, you can usually discern in there some streams of thought, some ideas, some misconceptions that you can just take one by one and slowly work your way through. I mean, a lot of my closest family and friends are not believers, so I'm very used to trying to listen and try to begin to answer the often very reasonable arguments that are made against theism.
Now, that was what intrigued me of what I've read of your argument in your book, is that, it seems to me that you take doubt or non-belief seriously, if not legitimately.
Very much so, because I myself was a non-believer until my early 30s. I was not raised in a Christian household, although I was baptised and went to Sunday school, but formal
sort of a cultural family inheritance of
correct.
Some sort.
It was that's precisely what it was. My great grandfather was a Presbyterian minister, but our nuclear family was not a religious family. Then I went to uni, studied law and other disciplines, practiced law. It wasn't until my early 30s that I even began to think about these issues with any sort of sophistication. And I quickly realised that there was an enormous gap in my knowledge, which up until then I'd thought was, pretty comprehensive.
So were you an atheist or an agnostic?
No, I was an agnostic, leaning towards atheism probably, but more out of disinterest than a conscious rejection.
Quite a traditional Australian standpoint. Not sort of bothered with it, not rejecting it as such, just not bothered with it.
Correct. It just, to the extent the subject ever sort of passed my mind, it prompted notions of boredom and irrelevance.
How do you see Australia then? So what is Australia? I've heard some people argue that it is a Christian nation. I've heard some people argue that it is a secular humanist nation. I've heard some people argue that you couldn't even categorise it, that it's a ridiculous question in the first place. Do you have a view on what Australia is in some sort of metaphysical sense?
I'd like to think it's still a Christian nation, but in truth I don't think it's ever been a deeply Christian nation. Tom Frame just wrote a book about this, Losing My Religion, and I more or less agree with his thesis that theology has never run deep in Australia. Even when quite large numbers went to church, Australia has never been a country like those in Europe or the United States where religion is truly an integral part of most people's lives. I mean, that's no longer true in Europe. It is still in America, and increasingly so in the third world, as far as Christianity is concerned. Australia, I think, is a candidate for the most irreligious country on earth. And I don't mean that necessarily in a derogatory sense. I love Australia. I think it's the most fortunate society on earth. But that very prosperity, that very peacefulness has come at a price. It's the great Australian apathy. I don't think people, even if they might call themselves Christians, I don't think people really understand much anymore what the term in fact means. And that's why critics like Dawkins and Hitchens and the other new atheists get away with murder, because in public discourse, even when they're being interviewed by very well-educated people in a secular sense, in the media, dare I say it, on the ABC, often they're not people who have any real background themselves in where these issues are, in truth, in intellectual circles, not just Christian, but atheist intellectual circles. Dawkins, in fact, is very shallow. There are much better atheist proponents, but he was treated like a god.
Who are the atheist proponents that you admire, that you respect their thinking, that you respect their arguments?
Well, someone like Terry Eagleton, for example, is an atheist. Perhaps proponent isn't the right word, but he's a confessed atheist. But he's written a book. He wrote a famous book review a couple of years ago, absolutely dissecting and demolishing the God delusion, on the perfectly correct grounds that it's an extremely shallow examination of faith and displayed next to no knowledge of the Bible. It's one tract in that it focuses on Dawkins' one true area of expertise, which is evolutionary biology. But he sees everything through that prism. And it's a very limited prism in terms of what faith is truly all about. I should hasten to add, I believe in evolution. I'm not here to argue young earth theories. I'm fascinated by evolution. I'm grateful to Richard Dawkins for the excellent books he's written about evolution. But his problem is he doesn't know the limits of his own expertise, and he, to use a legal expression, his evidence wouldn't even be admissible in court. He's simply not an expert. He has no qualifications in the relevant areas. In fact, he disdains theology. He says, I don't need to learn it because it's rubbish.